Out in the mid-Atlantic on May 22, 1943, at coordinates 30 degrees north latitude and 42 degrees west longitude, Lieutenant Commander William Drain gripped the controls of his GUM and TBF Avenger. As commanding officer of Composite Squadron 9, he banked his aircraft hard to starboard, his eyes fixed on the dark shape below, cutting through the grey expanse of water. The German submarine U-569 had just kicked into a crash dive. Spray erupted violently from her ballast tanks as compressed air screamed into the diving chambers with desperate urgency. Drain knew he had maybe 90 seconds, perhaps less, before his target slipped away into the depths and vanished from sight. The Avenger descended from 600 feet down to 300, each moment counting as Drain calculated where exactly to release his weapons. The timing had to be perfect. Drop too soon and the depth charges would miss their mark entirely. Drop too late and his own aircraft would be caught in the explosion. His radio operator called out distances while his turret gunner kept his weapon trained on the submarine's deck gun crew below, men who were desperately scrambling to man their weapon and fire back. 2 depth charges tumbled from his Avenger's bomb bay. The weapon struck the water just 15 feet behind the submarine's conning tower. 4 seconds felt like an eternity. Then twin geysers of white water erupted skyward as nearly 450 pounds of Torpex explosive detonated at 100 feet depth. The U-boat shuddered with violent force. Her stern lifted partially out of the water as the shockwave ruptured internal compartments and destroyed the vessel from within. Oil began spreading across the surface in an ever-widening slick, a dark stain on the grey water. Drain circled overhead, watching German sailors scramble desperately from the conning tower hatch, their movements frantic and urgent. The submarine was finished. Her pressure hull had been compromised beyond repair. She could not dive again. Her commander faced only one option left: abandon ship. Minutes later, 47 German sailors floated in their life jackets, watching their vessel settle stern first into 3,000 feet of dark water below. The Canadian destroyer HMCS St. Laurent moved in to rescue the survivors. 25 men were pulled from the Atlantic's cold embrace. 21 had either died in the attack or gone down with their boat. This kill represented a turning point that few in the United States Navy had anticipated coming. The aircraft that delivered this attack had flown from USS Bogue, an escort carrier that Navy leadership had dismissed as impractical just 3 years earlier. A ship that admirals had written off as too slow, too vulnerable, too insignificant to matter in modern naval warfare. Yet this unlikely vessel, converted from a merchant hull in less than 8 months, had just demonstrated a capability that would fundamentally transform the Battle of the Atlantic. In the months preceding this moment, German U-boats had been achieving unprecedented success against Allied shipping. During the first 20 days of March 1943 alone, Admiral Karl Dönitz's submarines had sunk 82 merchant ships, totaling 476,000 tons of cargo and vessels. The convoy battles that raged around HX-229 and SC-122 had destroyed 22 ships in just 4 days of fierce combat. British Admiralty reports concluded that Germany had never come closer to severing the Atlantic lifeline connecting North America and Britain. By May 1943, German U-boats had reached the absolute peak of their devastating power. 116 submarines prowled the Atlantic shipping lanes like predators. Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, had assembled wolfpacks of unprecedented size and coordination. The numbers painted a story of impending catastrophe for the Allies. U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than American shipyards could possibly replace them. The mid-Atlantic gap, that vast stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, had become a killing ground. Convoys sailing through this area did so without any air cover for 700 miles. U-boat commanders called it the Black Pit. Here submarines could surface, recharge their batteries, and attack convoys with near-complete impunity. Into this crisis sailed a weapon that Navy brass had fought bitterly against building. The escort carrier program had begun in December 1940 against the explicit opposition of the Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral Harold Stark and Navy Secretary Frank Knox had rejected the initial proposal, arguing that technological advances had made such vessels obsolete before they were even constructed. Knox had written to the Maritime Commission that a converted merchant vessel could no longer make a satisfactory aircraft carrier. Small carriers, they insisted, would become death traps. Too slow to escape enemy warships. Too lightly armed to defend themselves. Too small to carry enough aircraft to accomplish anything useful. The admirals possessed solid logic on their side. Modern carrier doctrine emphasized speed and striking power above all else. Fleet carriers could launch massive airstrikes, then steam away at 30 knots before enemy surface forces could engage them. They carried enough fighters to defend themselves against air attack. They had armor to survive bomb hits. Escort carriers would possess none of these advantages. They would lumber along at barely 16 knots. They would carry perhaps 24 aircraft at most. They would have zero armor protection whatsoever. Any enemy cruiser could overtake and destroy them with ease. President Franklin Roosevelt overruled the admirals. On December 21, 1940, he sent a memo ordering an emergency program to convert merchant ships into carriers specifically for anti-submarine warfare. The president grasped what the professional naval officers could not perceive. The Battle of the Atlantic was not being fought by fleet carriers against enemy fleets. It was being fought by submarines against defenseless merchant ships. The threat came from below the surface, not from enemy warships or aircraft overhead. What was needed was not striking power, but presence, not speed, but persistence. Not massive air wings, but continuous coverage overhead. A small carrier moving at 16 knots with 24 aircraft could patrol an area for weeks on end. A fleet carrier moving at 30 knots with 90 aircraft would burn through its fuel stocks in mere days. The mathematics favored slow, small, inexpensive carriers built in quantity over fast, large, costly carriers built in limited numbers. The first result was USS Long Island, commissioned on June 2, 1941. Built on a cargo ship hull, she displaced 7,800 tons, measured 495 feet in length, and could barely reach 16 knots. Her flight deck was a wooden platform bolted onto the merchant ship's structure. Her armor was essentially non-existent. Her aircraft capacity was limited to 21 planes. Navy aviators called her a joke. The press dubbed vessels like her baby flat-tops. Crews invented their own nickname for the CVE designation, claiming it stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. Everything about these ships violated the Navy's carrier doctrine, developed over 2 decades of naval thinking. Fleet carriers like Enterprise displaced 19,800 tons, made 32 knots, and carried 90 aircraft. They were the queens of the Pacific, armored, fast, and powerful. The escort carriers were simply merchant ships with flight decks bolted on. Yet the Atlantic battle was not being fought by fleet carriers at all. It was being lost in the mid-ocean gap where convoys had absolutely no air support. Land-based aircraft from Newfoundland could cover the western approaches. British planes from Northern Ireland protected the eastern approaches, but in between lay 700 miles of empty ocean. U-boats owned this space completely. The first escort carriers to reach the Atlantic were British vessels operating under Royal Navy command. HMS Audacity, converted from a German prize ship, began operations in September 1941. Her aircraft drove off Fokker-Wulf Condor bombers that had been shadowing convoys and calling in U-boats to attack. In December 1941, Audacity's fighters shot down 2 Condors and forced 3 U-boats to break off their attacks. Then U-751 torpedoed and sank her. The Royal Navy had proven the concept worked. They had also demonstrated the terrible vulnerability that made American admirals hesitate and doubt. The United States Maritime Commission had contracted with Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding to build C-class type cargo ships for the merchant marine. These vessels, designed for commercial service, used steam turbines that could drive them at 19 knots, faster than the diesel-powered merchantmen that had been converted earlier. When the Navy requisitioned 20 hulls for carrier conversion, the Seattle-Tacoma yard possessed the advantage of modifying ships before completion, rather than converting finished vessels. The modifications were extensive but pragmatic in nature. Workers cut away the cargo holds and upper deck structure. They then built a hangar deck inside the hull space. Two elevators connected the hangar to a 442-foot flight deck. A single hydraulic catapult assisted aircraft launches. A small island structure built out over the starboard side kept the flight deck clear and housed the bridge and flight control. The ships retained their merchant marine profile below the flight deck, with vertical sides and a flat bottom that rolled viciously in heavy seas. Armament was purely defensive in nature. Two 5-inch guns, one forward and one aft, 8 twin-mounted 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, 27 20mm Oerlikon cannons. This weaponry could defend against aircraft, but would prove useless against any surface warship. Speed remained the ship's primary defense, and at 18 knots they had precious little of that. The lead ship of the class, USS Bogue, was commissioned on September 26, 1942. Captain Giles Short took command of a vessel with a standard displacement of 8,390 tons and 13,980 tons fully loaded. Her crew of 890 men included aviators from Composite Squadron 9, flying 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and 9 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. After shakedown operations revealed numerous mechanical problems, Bogue entered the yard for 2 months of repairs. When she finally sailed for the Atlantic in February 1943, the situation had grown dire. U-boat attacks had reached catastrophic levels. The Navy's operational plan for escort carriers called for them to accompany convoys, providing continuous air coverage through the mid-Atlantic gap. Bogue made her first 3 crossings in March and April 1943, using this defensive doctrine. Her aircraft flew search patterns ahead of convoys, looking for surfaced submarines. When they found U-boats, the submarines simply dove beneath the surface. The escorts lacked weapons capable of attacking submerged targets effectively. The U-boats waited for the convoy to pass, then surfaced and attacked from behind. In 3 crossings, Bogue's aircraft did not sink a single submarine. Navy critics pointed to this as proof the escort carriers were failures, too slow to chase U-boats, too small to carry enough aircraft for effective searches, too vulnerable to risk in offensive operations. The Bureau of Aeronautics prepared a report recommending the escort carrier program be terminated after existing contracts were completed. Then Admiral Ernest King changed everything. As Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, King had been watching the British develop hunter-killer tactics. Instead of tying escort carriers to convoy defense, the British were experimenting with independent groups that hunted U-boats in areas where intelligence indicated submarine activity. In May 1943, King ordered American escort carriers to form hunter-killer groups that would operate independently from convoys. Bogue became the nucleus of the first American hunter-killer group. Accompanied by Ford-class destroyers, she departed Norfolk on April 22, 1943, with orders to seek out and destroy German submarines in the Central Atlantic. Her commander, Captain Short, had complete freedom to pursue any U-boat contact. Intelligence from HFDF, high-frequency direction-finding equipment, and from decoded Enigma messages would guide the group to areas of submarine concentration. The transformation from defensive convoy escort to offensive hunter began immediately. On May 21st, while escorting convoy ON-184, Bogue's HFDF operators detected radio transmissions from multiple U-boats. Wolfpack Mosul, consisting of 21 submarines, was gathering to attack the convoy. Lieutenant Commander Drain launched 5 Avengers to hunt the transmitting submarines. The aircraft caught U-231 on the surface, recharging her batteries. Depth charges damaged the submarine's radio transmitters, forcing her to abort her patrol and return to France. The next day brought the breakthrough that validated the entire escort carrier concept. Multiple Bogue aircraft executed 5 separate attacks on different submarines throughout the day. U-305 suffered moderate damage. U-569 took catastrophic hits that forced her crew to scuttle. This marked the first U-boat sunk by United States Navy escort carrier aircraft. More importantly, it demonstrated that hunter-killer groups could disrupt Wolfpack operations before they reached convoys. After delivering convoy ON-184 safely to Argentina on May 26, Bogue received new orders. No more convoy escort, pure hunter-killer operations. Intelligence would direct her group to submarine concentration areas. Her aircraft would saturate those areas with search patterns. Any U-boat found would be attacked with depth charges, later with homing torpedoes. The hunter-killer offensive had begun. On June 5, 1943, Bogue's aircraft found U-217 refueling from a submarine tanker in mid-Atlantic. The Avengers caught both submarines on the surface. Their depth charges sent U-217 to the bottom, with all hands lost. A week later, on June 12, aircraft from Composite Squadron 9 located U-118 attempting to charge her batteries. The submarine crashed, dived, but too slowly. Depth charges ruptured her pressure hull at 150 feet depth. She sank with 49 crew members. July 23 brought 2 kills in a single day. Bogue's aircraft spotted U-527 on the surface for her daily battery charge. Rockets and depth charges left her crippled and sinking. 12 survivors were rescued by destroyer Clemson and transferred to Bogue's brig. On the same patrol, destroyer George E. Badger, part of Bogue's screen, gained sonar contact on U-603. Depth charges destroyed the submarine before she could launch the mines she was carrying to American coastal waters. The pattern continued through the summer and fall of 1943. Bogue's 8th patrol from November to December became her most successful. On December 13th, U-172 was located through HF-DF intercepts. Aircraft from Bogue coordinated with 4 destroyers in a 27-hour running battle that would demonstrate the lethal effectiveness of the new hunter-killer doctrine. The submarine twisted through the water, desperate to escape. She dove deep, then surfaced, searching frantically for any way out. But there was no escape. The relentless pursuit continued until she finally went down beneath the waves. 13 crew members were killed and 46 taken prisoner. By December 20th, the patrol ended with the destruction of U-850. Within just 6 weeks, this single escort carrier group had eliminated 3 German submarines. By the year's end in 1943, Bogue and her escort ships had sent 11 German U-boats and 2 Japanese submarines to the ocean floor. During her time protecting convoys, not a single merchant vessel was lost while under Bogue's guard. None of the pilots from Composite Squadron 9 were shot down by enemy aircraft throughout the entire war. Her task group earned a Presidential Unit Citation for 6 of her 8 patrols, a distinction that made her the most successful anti-submarine warfare carrier of the entire conflict. Yet this triumph belonged to more than one ship. USS Card, built to the same design as Bogue, launched hunter-killer operations in August 1943. Her aircraft and destroyer escorts would destroy 11 U-boats before war's end. USS Corregidor accounted for 7 kills. USS Block Island destroyed 7 submarines before she herself was torpedoed and sunk by U-549 on May 29, 1944, becoming the only American escort carrier lost to submarine attack in the Atlantic. The transformation sweeping across the Battle of the Atlantic could be seen in the hard numbers. During March 1943, U-boats sent 82 ships to the bottom, totaling 476,000 tons in the Atlantic. April brought continued devastation with 39 vessels and 235,000 tons lost. Then came May, a month that would haunt German submariners forever as Black May. 41 U-boats went down during May 1943. The destruction was unlike anything submarine warfare had ever witnessed. 18 were destroyed in convoy battles, overwhelmed by enhanced escort tactics and newly developed weapons. 14 fell to aircraft patrols equipped with advanced radar technology that could spot surfaced submarines even through darkness or thick fog. The remaining U-boats were lost to mines, equipment failures, bombardment, and coordinated hunter-killer groups like Bogue's task force. Among those destroyed were 5 critical U-tanker supply vessels. These submarines carried fuel oil for other U-boats, allowing them to operate far from German bases. The Type 14 submarines, nicknamed milk cows by their crews, each carried 700 tons of fuel oil, 4 torpedoes, and supplies for long missions at sea. Each tanker could refuel a dozen attack submarines, extending their operational range by thousands of miles across open ocean. Without these supply ships, operational range collapsed dramatically. Submarines could no longer reach the rich hunting grounds of the Central Atlantic and the Caribbean, where merchant convoys sailed vulnerable and exposed. They retreated to operate closer to European waters, where Allied defenses were thickest and most powerful. The toll on U-boat crews was devastating to their morale and confidence. Submarines accustomed to achieving multiple kills on each patrol now struggled simply to survive. Boats that surfaced at night to recharge their batteries found themselves spotted by radar-equipped aircraft within minutes. Wolf packs that gathered to overwhelm escort vessels discovered that escort carriers could direct destroyers toward them before they could even coordinate their attacks. The hunters had become the hunted. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Donitz transmitted an encrypted message to every U-boat at sea. The losses had grown too heavy to bear. All submarines were ordered to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes and return to base. The Wolfpacks had been defeated in battle. After 3 years and 8 months of nearly continuous victories, the German submarine campaign had been shattered in just 3 weeks. The U-boat withdrawal represented the turning point in the Atlantic struggle, though the fighting would continue. Donitz refused to accept permanent defeat. He directed German engineering and industrial capability toward developing revolutionary submarine types capable of remaining submerged for extended periods. The Type 21 U-boat featured improved batteries and a streamlined hull design that allowed it to travel at 17 knots underwater, faster than most Allied escort vessels. If enough of these advanced boats could be deployed, they might regain the advantage. Meanwhile, American escort carrier production accelerated rapidly. Henry Kaiser's massive shipyards at Vancouver, Washington, began producing Casablanca-class carriers at an extraordinary pace. Kaiser, an industrialist with no prior shipbuilding experience before the war, had revolutionized naval construction by applying mass production techniques from automobile manufacturing and building construction. These escort carriers, designed and built from the keel up rather than converted from existing merchant vessels, incorporated lessons learned from earlier designs. Kaiser's shipyards used prefabricated sections constructed in enormous assembly facilities. Workers welded together hull sections, deckhouse modules, and machinery spaces inland, then transported these completed assemblies to the building ways. This modular construction method dramatically reduced building time. The first Casablanca-class carriers required 8 months from keel laying to commissioning. By the middle of production, Kaiser's workers had compressed this time frame to 3.5 months. Welding crews operated around the clock on 3 rotating shifts. Women with little previous industrial experience worked welding equipment alongside seasoned shipyard workers. The yards executed orchestrated construction sequences where multiple teams worked simultaneously on different sections of every ship. 50 Casablanca-class ships were ordered on June 18, 1942. USS Casablanca herself was commissioned on July 8, 1943. The 50th ship was completed exactly 1 year later, on July 8, 1944. This achieved an average commissioning rate of 1 carrier every 7 3/10 days. At peak production, Kaiser's facilities were launching completed escort carriers faster than some shipyards could build destroyers. These ships emerged with improved stability, superior aviation facilities, and more dependable machinery than the converted merchantmen of earlier classes. Each carrier displaced 7,800 tons, achieved 19 knots, and operated 28 aircraft. Though still slow and vulnerable compared to fleet carriers, they proved perfectly suited for anti-submarine operations. The Hunter-Killer offensive continued with increased force throughout 1944. The tactics making escort carrier groups so effective evolved directly from combat experience. Pilots from Composite Squadron 9 and other carrier air groups perfected the coordination between visual search, radar detection, and attack procedures. The Grumman F-4F Avenger became the ideal anti-submarine aircraft. It could carry depth charges, acoustic homing torpedoes, or rockets depending on tactical requirements. Its extended range permitted patrols far from the carrier. Its rugged construction allowed operations in weather conditions that kept lighter aircraft grounded. The Avenger's 3-man crew included pilot, radio man, and turret gunner, each trained to take command if another was disabled. Depth charges served as the primary weapon through 1943. Mark 44 acoustic homing torpedoes introduced in early 1944 transformed anti-submarine warfare completely. Nicknamed Fido by their operators, these weapons could lock onto a submarine's engine noise and follow the vessel automatically. Once dropped near a diving U-boat, the torpedo would circle until it picked up propeller sounds, then pursue the submarine on its own. U-boat commanders found their traditional crash-dive escape tactic no longer worked. The noise created during their diving procedures attracted the very weapons they sought to evade. Escort carrier groups developed intricate search patterns covering vast areas of ocean. Aircraft flew sector searches, each plane assigned a specific patrol zone. When one aircraft spotted a submarine, the carrier directed additional aircraft to the location, while destroyers raced toward the contact at high speed. The submarine faced attacks from multiple directions at once. Surface ships forced the boat to remain submerged, while aircraft circled overhead, waiting for any surfacing attempt. This sustained pressure could continue for hours or even days until the submarine's batteries were depleted or its crew chose to surrender. In October 1944, Admiral Francis Lowe, Chief of Staff of the 10th Fleet, wrote to Admiral King in a memo that escort carrier support groups accounted for approximately 60% of all U-boats destroyed by United States forces in the Atlantic and Mediterranean during the 6-month period, from April through September. This remarkable success ratio showed how thoroughly these converted merchant vessels had revolutionized naval aviation tactics. The hunter-killer groups had become more effective than land-based patrol aircraft, despite operating from ships that senior Navy leadership had initially rejected as inadequate. Beyond their combat achievements, escort carriers proved valuable in ways early skeptics had never anticipated. They served as aircraft ferries, transporting planes from American factories to combat zones. USS Bogu made several trips to Glasgow, Scotland, carrying Army Air Force fighters. These missions freed fleet carriers for operations in the Pacific. Escort carriers provided air cover for amphibious landings. Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, employed 4 escort carriers among its support forces. Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France in August 1944, used 2 escort carriers for close air support. These slower converted merchant vessels could linger near invasion beaches. Their aircraft remained available for immediate support missions that faster fleet carriers could not provide. They trained replacement pilots in carrier operations. USS Charger operated off the East Coast throughout the war, qualifying thousands of naval aviators in carrier landings before they deployed to combat zones. This training prevented fleet carriers from being diverted from combat for pilot qualification. Most importantly, escort carriers vindicated President Roosevelt's strategic vision. The president had recognized that winning the Atlantic required closing the air gap. Land-based aircraft could not reach mid-ocean. Fleet carriers were too precious and too few to remain tied to convoy escort duty. Escort carriers offered the only practical solution, affordable to build in large numbers, capable enough to operate aircraft effectively, and available in sufficient quantities to provide continuous protection. The production numbers revealed America's industrial response to crisis. Of the 151 aircraft carriers built by the United States during the war, 122 were escort carriers. Approximately 80 were commissioned in the United States Navy during wartime. Another 38 were delivered to Britain under Lend-Lease agreements. Production peaked in 1944 when American shipyards completed 47 escort carriers. This flood of vessels overwhelmed the U-boat threat through sheer abundance. By late 1944, only 6 American escort carriers remained assigned to Atlantic anti-submarine operations. The remainder were sent to the Pacific, where they would prove equally valuable in an entirely different role. The Atlantic had been won. The hunters had become prey. The cost, however, had been significant. 6 American escort carriers were lost to enemy action during the war. USS Liscome Bay was torpedoed by Japanese submarine I-175 off the Gilbert Islands on November 24, 1943. The torpedo ignited the ship's bomb magazine. She went down in 23 minutes with 644 men perishing. USS Block Island was destroyed by U-549 in the Atlantic. 4 more escort carriers would be sunk in Pacific operations, yet measured against their impact, the cost remained acceptable. By war's end, 11 American Atlantic escort carrier task groups had destroyed 53 German submarines. This included the most remarkable anti-submarine achievement of the entire conflict: the capture of U-505 intact on June 4, 1944. Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding officer of escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, had spent months planning this operation. His task group had practiced boarding procedures repeatedly. When destroyers detected U-505 submerged about 150 miles off Spanish Sahara, Gallery ordered a relentless depth charge attack. The submarine, unable to escape and running dangerously low on battery power, surfaced after 8 hours of pursuit. As U-505 broke the surface, her crew began abandoning ship. They expected the Americans would sink their boat with gunfire, standard procedure in submarine warfare, but Gallery had ordered his ships to hold fire. As German sailors swam away from their submarine, a boarding party led by Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David transferred from destroyer USS Pillsbury in a whaleboat. David and 8 men climbed aboard the seemingly doomed submarine, expecting demolition charges to explode at any moment. They discovered the boat was intact. Scuttling charges had been set but failed to detonate. The boarding party disabled the charges, sealed the flooding valves, and secured the vessel. It was the first enemy vessel captured at sea by the United States Navy since the War of 1812. U-505 yielded invaluable intelligence. Her Enigma machine and codebooks provided cryptographers crucial insights into German naval communications. Her acoustic torpedoes gave Allied scientists actual examples of weapons they had only encountered in battle. Her charts revealed U-boat patrol routes and operational procedures. The capture remained classified throughout the war to prevent Germans from modifying their codes and procedures. U-505 is now permanently displayed at Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry as a National Historic Landmark. The total U-boat losses to escort carrier groups represented only a fraction of the 785 German submarines lost during the conflict, yet the impact exceeded the raw numbers significantly. Escort carrier groups forced U-boats to remain submerged for extended periods, limiting their effectiveness severely. They prevented wolfpack concentration. They safeguarded convoys that transported 15 million tons of supplies to Britain during the crucial period from May 1943 through June 1944. Perhaps most significantly, escort carriers destroyed the mythology surrounding submarine warfare since World War I. The belief that submarines were virtually undetectable, that they could strike with impunity from beneath the waves, that no defense existed against underwater assault had dominated naval thinking for decades. Escort carriers proved that continuous air coverage could locate, track, and destroy submarines effectively. They demonstrated that merchant hulls and commercial construction methods could produce combat-capable warships in months instead of years. Naval doctrine transformed rapidly. By late 1944, the Navy had integrated escort carriers into every aspect of naval operations. They sailed with fleet carrier task forces as replenishment vessels, ferrying replacement aircraft to combat carriers. They provided anti-submarine screens for battleship groups and cruiser task forces. They accompanied amphibious assault forces, delivering close air support that fleet carriers could not provide while remaining far enough offshore to avoid coastal defenses. In the Pacific, escort carriers became essential to the island-hopping campaign that would ultimately bring victory over Japan. The waters off Leyte Gulf in October 1944 witnessed a clash that would define naval courage for generations to come. 6 escort carriers belonging to Taffy 3 suddenly found themselves facing the oncoming Japanese center force. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers were bearing down on them with murderous intent. The moment of contact arrived at dawn, just after 6:48 in the morning, when lookouts aboard USS Fanshawe Bay spotted the distinctive pagoda-shaped masts rising above the horizon. Within minutes, massive 18-inch shells from the battleship Yamato were screaming through the air, sending up geysers of water around the small American carriers. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, found himself in a nightmare scenario. His force consisted of 6 escort carriers and 7 escort destroyers. The Japanese armada outgunned them catastrophically, outnumbered them vastly, and possessed far greater speed. The nearest American fleet carriers lay over 100 miles distant, impossibly far away. Behind his formation stretched the invasion beaches, packed with vulnerable transport ships and landing craft. Thousands of American soldiers aboard those vessels depended entirely on what happened in the next few hours. If the Japanese broke through, those men would face slaughter on an industrial scale. Sprague made his decision instantly. He ordered every aircraft in the task force launched, regardless of what weapons they carried or whether they carried weapons at all. The torpedo bombers had been loaded with depth charges meant for hunting submarines. Fighter planes carried machine guns and small bombs designed for supporting troops on shore. Some aircraft took to the air with nothing but empty racks, their pilots knowing they would have to make dry runs and hoped their presence alone might rattle the Japanese gunners. The escort carriers wheeled sharply to the east, turning into the wind to launch their aircraft. They pushed their engines to maximum power, racing toward a rain squall visible on the horizon. Perhaps that storm could give them temporary shelter from the withering Japanese gunfire. For 2 hours and 30 minutes, these converted merchant vessels performed miracles. They dodged shells from battleship main batteries, watching the water erupt around them in violent columns. Their aircraft attacked an enemy force vastly superior in every conventional measure. Destroyers and escort destroyers charged directly at the Japanese formation, launching torpedoes and hurling 5-inch shells at battleships and cruisers, knowing they were outmatched but refusing to yield. The escorts were destroyed one by one, but every ship that went down bought precious time. Japanese Admiral Takeo Kureta became increasingly uncertain about what he faced. Radio intercepts convinced him that American fleet carriers were present, not just these small, improvised vessels. Confused and believing himself outnumbered by superior forces, Kureta made the crucial decision to withdraw. At 9:25 in the morning, the Japanese force turned away. The small American carriers had stood their ground and prevailed, but the cost was terrible. USS Gambier Bay took repeated hits from Japanese cruisers. Shells tore through her unarmored hull, shredding her structure. She lost power, rolled onto her side, and sank beneath the waves, taking 147 sailors with her. USS St. Lo managed to survive the surface engagement, only to face a different kind of horror. At just after 10 in the morning, the first organized kamikaze attack of the entire war descended upon her. A Mitsubishi Zero, possibly piloted by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, plunged through her flight deck and detonated in the hangar below, where fueled and armed aircraft were being prepared. The secondary explosions were apocalyptic. The ship was torn apart from the inside. She sank 30 minutes later, claiming 113 lives. Yet somehow, the remaining 4 escort carriers of Taffy 3 managed to escape. The Battle of Samar revealed both the shocking vulnerability and the surprising resilience of escort carriers. These ships had been designed primarily for hunting submarines and protecting convoys. They were never intended to face battleships or cruisers. Yet they had stood toe-to-toe with the enemy's capital ships and endured. Their sacrifice had been the difference between Japanese victory and American survival at a critical moment in the Pacific War. Naval historians would later describe it as the most gallant action in the entire history of the United States Navy. After the war, researchers conducted extensive analysis of what these vessels had truly accomplished. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined the records and reached a startling conclusion. Escort carriers had been absolutely instrumental in defeating the U-boat offensive in the Atlantic. Throughout the middle years of the war, there was a stretch of ocean in the mid-Atlantic gap where land-based aircraft could not reach. If not for continuous air coverage from escort carriers in that region, convoy losses would have become catastrophic and unsustainable. Britain faced the grim possibility of being forced to reduce imports below levels necessary for survival. The massive build-up for D-Day, which required transporting millions upon millions of tons of supplies across the Atlantic, might have been delayed indefinitely or cancelled altogether. Every division that waded ashore in Normandy had made its journey across the ocean under the protective umbrella of escort carrier groups. After Germany's defeat, researchers gained access to German naval records. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the German U-boat commander, had considered the American escort carrier threat absolutely existential to submarine operations. In his post-war memoirs, Dönitz wrote candidly that the appearance of American escort carriers in the spring of 1943 had forced a complete reconsideration of every submarine tactic and strategy. Surfacing became impossible in areas where carrier groups operated. Battery charging, which had to happen at the surface, was now constantly threatened by aircraft overhead. It could only be attempted at night, and even then under constant danger. The time it took for U-boats to transit from one patrol area to another increased dramatically. Submarines had to creep through carrier patrol zones while submerged, burning precious battery power in their desperate efforts to avoid detection. The psychological weight on U-boat crews became almost unbearable. Submarines that had once cruised on the surface freely, running on their diesel engines, now found themselves imprisoned underwater for days at a time. The air inside those metal tubes became foul with carbon dioxide as the atmosphere deteriorated. Battery cells began failing from the constant drain. Navigation became nearly impossible when submarines could not surface to take celestial observations and fix their position. Morale collapsed as patrol after patrol returned with no ship sunk, no victories, only the grinding exhaustion of constant danger. By the end of 1943, veteran U-boat commanders were requesting transfers to surface ships. New crews required extensive psychological preparation before they could be sent on their first patrol. Dönitz had placed his hopes on a revolutionary new design, the Type 21 submarine. These boats featured streamlined hulls and massive battery banks representing a technological leap forward. They could achieve 17 knots while remaining submerged, faster than most escort vessels, and fast enough to evade the depth charges that had become so deadly. They could stay underwater for extended periods, eliminating the vulnerability that escort carriers had so mercilessly exploited. But these revolutionary boats emerged far too late and in far too few numbers to change the war's outcome. Production delays and bombing raids on construction facilities meant only 118 were completed before Germany surrendered. Just 4 Type 21s conducted operational patrols before the war ended. None of them ever encountered an American escort carrier in battle. For the men who served aboard escort carriers, the war experience was filled with stark contradictions. Living conditions aboard these vessels were cramped beyond anything sailors on fleet carriers had ever endured. The converted merchant ships lacked the amenities deliberately designed into purpose-built warships. Ventilation systems proved inadequate in tropical waters and painfully insufficient during North Atlantic storms. Crew berthing spaces were filled with bunks stacked 3 high, leaving barely enough room to squeeze into them. These small carriers rolled terribly in rough seas. Their flat bottoms and high sides created maximum leverage for the ocean swells to work against. Sailors joked grimly that escort carriers would roll over on wet grass. The flight deck crews performed their dangerous work under conditions that would have been deemed impossible on larger fleet carriers. They serviced aircraft in weather that would have caused fleet carriers to suspend all flight operations. They launched and recovered aircraft in seas so heavy that the small carriers bounced around like toy boats. They armed torpedoes and depth charges while standing on flight decks, pitching at 30-degree angles. Everything was harder, everything was colder, everything was wetter, and everything was far more dangerous than it was on the big carriers. Pilots faced their own unique struggles. The short flight decks left absolutely no margin for error when landing. An Avenger pilot attempting to land on a 442-foot deck had to catch one of 8 arresting wires while the ship was rolling perhaps 15 degrees in heavy seas. Miss those wires and the crash barriers represented the only chance of avoiding a plunge into the ocean. Somehow, pilots from Composite Squadron 9 made thousands of successful landings without losing a single aircraft to enemy action. Yet these pilots who flew from escort carrier decks developed an intensely fierce pride in their ships. They understood fully that their vessels were underpowered, underarmed, and underprotected. They gave them harsh nicknames like Kaiser coffins and Jeep carriers. The CVE designation, they said, stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. But they also possessed absolute knowledge that their ships had changed the course of the entire war. One pilot from Composite Squadron 9, recalling his experiences decades later, said it simply and directly. "We flew from a merchant ship with a flight deck nailed on top. We sank submarines that were supposed to be sinking us. The brass said we couldn't do it. We did it anyway." The escort carrier story vindicated not just a type of ship, but an entire philosophy of industrial warfare. American shipyards had produced these carriers using assembly line techniques adapted directly from automobile manufacturing. Henry Kaiser had never built a ship before the war began. His background was in constructing massive dams and highways. He approached shipbuilding as an engineering problem to be solved, not as a craft tradition to be honored. Workers who had never held a welding torch in 1940 were building aircraft carriers by 1943. Sections were prefabricated inland and then transported to shipyards where they were welded together. Women workers, many with no prior shipbuilding experience, operated cranes and welding equipment on those assembly lines. Rosie the Riveter was no propaganda invention, but a daily reality on Kaiser's production floors. Ships that would have required 2 years to build using traditional peacetime methods were completed in 8 months using modular construction techniques. By the end of the war, construction times had dropped to 3.5 months. This approach violated every principle of traditional naval architecture that emphasized custom construction and meticulous handcraftsmanship. Naval architects trained at Annapolis and the Naval War College viewed each ship as a unique creation, built to exacting specifications by skilled craftsmen. Kaiser's system treated ships as manufactured products, stamped out like automobiles with interchangeable parts and standardized procedures. The naval establishment called this industrial barbarism. Yet when tested in combat, they proved devastatingly effective. Their weapons worked, their aircraft flew, their crews fought ferociously and won. Ships that naval architects had called floating death traps survived combat with battleships. The carriers that the Bureau of Aeronautics had wanted to cancel sank 53 U-boats. The vessels that admirals had dismissed with contempt closed the mid-Atlantic gap and won the Battle of the Atlantic. Roosevelt's judgment had been completely vindicated. The president, with no formal naval training, had grasped the nature of modern warfare far better than admirals with decades of professional service. When the final accounting was completed, it showed approximately 80 escort carriers commissioned in the United States Navy during World War II. Of these, only 6 were lost to enemy action, representing a loss rate of just 6.7%. This compared very favorably to the 13% loss rate suffered by fleet and light carriers. The converted merchant vessels had proven as survivable as their much larger cousins, despite carrying no armor protection and mounting only minimal defensive armament. Their combat record was equally impressive. Escort carrier groups sank 53 German submarines and over 30 Japanese submarines. They shot down hundreds of enemy aircraft across multiple theaters of war. They supported amphibious landings ranging from North Africa to Okinawa. They ferried thousands upon thousands of replacement aircraft to combat zones. They trained tens of thousands of naval aviators in the techniques of carrier operations. Beyond mere numbers and statistics, escort carriers fundamentally changed how naval wars were fought. They demonstrated that quantity could overwhelm quality, that adequate ships in sufficient numbers could beat superior ships in limited quantities. They proved that industrial capacity was itself a powerful form of military might. They showed that unconventional solutions to tactical problems could succeed where orthodox approaches had failed. The admirals who had vigorously opposed escort carriers back in 1940 never publicly acknowledged their error or changed their stated positions. But the Navy's post-war planning incorporated escort carriers as essential fleet units. The Commencement Bay class consisted of 40 ships ordered beginning in 1943. These were purpose-designed escort carriers built to naval rather than merchant standards. Though only 19 were completed before the war ended, these ships demonstrated that the Navy had fully embraced the concept that had been so controversial just years before. This transformation from skepticism to acceptance reflected a broader shift in American military thinking during the war years. At the beginning, Professional military officers deeply distrusted civilian interference in strategic decisions. President Roosevelt's order to build escort carriers over explicit Navy objections represented exactly the kind of political meddling that officers had feared and resisted. Yet Roosevelt had ultimately been proven correct. His strategic vision had identified a critical need that professional naval officers had completely missed. When the war ended in August 1945, the Navy faced a question about what to do with dozens of escort carriers. Most were obsolete before they ever sailed, designed for wartime needs that peacetime no longer required. 33 were transferred to Allied nations under military assistance programs. Many others were scrapped immediately or placed in reserve storage. A few found new roles in peace as helicopter carriers or training vessels. By 1960, every single escort carrier from the World War II era had been retired or transferred away. Not one survived as a museum ship preserved for history. Yet their impact endured in profound ways. Post-war carrier design directly incorporated lessons learned from escort carrier operations. The critical importance of continuous flight operations, the value of numerous smaller carriers versus a few massive ones, the integration of anti-submarine warfare and air superiority missions, all had been proven in actual combat aboard these converted merchantmen. Modern naval aviation doctrine traces directly back to innovations developed on these improvised warships. The U-boat threat they had so completely defeated never returned. German submarine construction after the war focused on coastal defense and intelligence gathering rather than the commerce raiding that had threatened Britain. The Soviet Union built hundreds of submarines during the Cold War, but never attempted the kind of coordinated wolfpack campaigns that escort carriers had methodically destroyed in 1943. Anti-submarine warfare remained an important naval mission, but the combination of helicopters, long-range patrol aircraft, and sophisticated sonar systems made surface hunting unnecessary. Perhaps the greatest tribute to escort carriers was their own obsolescence. They had been built to meet one specific crisis, the U-boat threat in the Atlantic. They had met that crisis so completely and so thoroughly that the mission ceased to exist entirely. No subsequent conflict required the conversion of merchant ships into makeshift carriers. The escort carriers had done their job so devastatingly well that nothing resembling them was ever needed again. In final analysis, escort carriers represented American industrial warfare at its most effective and practical. Simple enough to build quickly, adequate enough to be genuinely combat effective, available in sufficient numbers to overwhelm the opposition. The critics who had dismissed them as death traps in 1940 had been judging them by peacetime standards. These converted merchantmen had been designed for war, and in war they had proven devastatingly practical and effective. The statistics told the story starkly. From 116 operational U-boats in May 1943 to just 51 by August 1943, a transformation occurred in a mere 3 months. Escort carriers were not the only factor in this remarkable victory. Long-range patrol aircraft, improved radar systems, code-breaking capabilities, and aggressive destroyer tactics all contributed substantially. But the converted merchantmen had closed the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats had been completely untouchable. They had hunted submarines in areas where land-based aircraft could never reach. They had turned the hunters into prey, and history remembered them as absolutely essential.